Hello everyone, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show. My guest today is Professor John Mortensen, a leading performer, scholar, and teacher in classical or historic improvisation. He's a Steinway Artist, a Fulbright Scholar, and is a professor of music at Cedarville University. His new book is The Pianist's Guide to Historic Improvisation, published by Oxford University Press. Kate Boyd, professor of music at Butler University, reviewed the book by saying, "This book fills an important niche in the world of piano and keyboard pedagogy. In each of the chapters, Mortensen encourages the reader's creativity, simultaneously exposing musical building blocks used by some of the great composers and allowing the reader to apply some of those same compositional techniques to improvising in a stylistically appropriate way." It debuted at #1 on Amazon's piano and music instruction category. Professor Mortensen, it's great to have you back on the show.
Good to talk to you today, Nikhil. How are you?
I'm great. Congratulations on your new book. It's really fantastic. I had the pleasure of reading the Kindle version over the week, and unfortunately the paperback, due to COVID, hasn't reached me in time, but it's on the way.
Yeah, I understand that it's not really made to be read on a tablet. I find that most people prefer to have a paper copy.
Oh, me too.
Because they're at the piano. And actually, one of my students showed me they took the paperback to a copy center and they had the binding cut off and put a spiral binding on. And I think that's the best way because then it lays flat. And unfortunately, they wouldn't publish it for me that way, but so we have to adapt.
Let's help the audience here by giving some idea of the landscape for books on classical improvisation for the piano. On your website, you have a great page dedicated to resources on this topic, where you pretty much cover the landscape of what's out there. Before your book was published, there were not that many books out there on this topic, and the few that were out there were typically very scholarly, and they could be quite intimidating. Is that a fair assessment of the landscape?
Yes, I think so. What it shows is that the academy is very fractured on this and many other topics, and much of the work that's being done in improvisation is coming from musicologists and theorists, and so their first concern is not, let's get all these keyboard players doing this and that. Their first concern is to document things and write good articles, which they're doing. And so I'm very happy to be in communication with all of those folks and benefit from their work. But I just feel like my work is in another area. It's getting people to sit down and be able to do something that isn't scripted. For that reason, there's not that much out there. What you tend to have is either very, very popular level books where they might say, well, this is an Alberti bass, and on top of that, you can go up and down the scale. Now try it over this chord, and that's fine for a very beginning level, but that's really about all it is. And then on the other hand, you have people say, well, just play all the preludes and fugues of Bach and you'll know how to improvise a fugue. It's been difficult for people to find their way forward.
How long did it take you to write the book, and when did you begin? Did you have to revise things as you were writing it? Because I've noticed there's almost a torrent of new information almost by the week that comes out, new treatises being translated, all sorts of things. Have you found it changed as you were writing it?
Yes, it did. It really, from the time I started to when I sent it in, the final version was probably 3 years. And at that point, you realize the truth of the old saying, books are never finished, they're only abandoned. And that, of course, is because I'm changing and I'm learning new approaches and having new ideas, and other people are publishing new stuff. So at some point, you just have to cut it off and send it away out into the world, or else you'll never finish.
Let's get into the book, because really a lot of people are tuning into this because they want to know about this book. They want to get excited about the book, and just to hear more perspectives on how you planned it. And could you actually just talk about who you aimed this book for, specifically the audience?
The book is for, first of all, I wrote it for myself because I wanted to learn how to do all this and how to teach it. And so I was actually the primary audience is, I will figure this out as I go, which is how I've done everything in my life. Give myself the job of teaching it, and that will spur me to figure it out. So that's one element. But it's actually for music school students undergraduate or graduate, and actually the faculty who've never improvised, professional performing musicians, and educated amateurs. And the reason I could write for all of those groups at the same time is because even though their professional abilities, their technical abilities might differ, their experience with improvisation is all going to be about the same. And that's why it's actually possible to talk to all these groups simultaneously.
How did you compile the information? Because we know there's the German tradition, the French, Italian tradition. Is this kind of leaning German, leaning Italian? How do you kind of surmise the whole book?
It does not rise to any such lofty level as leaning this way or that way. It's just stuff I figured out along the way. And what I was really trying to do is, yes, eventually get into the historic ways of learning this stuff, rule of the octave and Parlamento and Schemata and all this stuff. All of that is in there. But I also knew that I would lose a large portion of the reading audience if I made them do the obstacle course of history that you have to do to get to that stuff. They needed, I wanted them to have something they could play in the first chapter, because that's why they're here. It's why they showed up. They want music, not footnotes. And so with all respect to my colleagues who are great at footnotes, I'm not. So I feel simpatico with the reader who doesn't care about that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's why I started with Figuration Prelude. Because Figuration Prelude, if you're somewhat experienced musically and you can get around the keyboard at an intermediate level, you can play Figuration Preludes on your first day. And so that was to give a reward to the reader right away and say, you can do this. You can go show your colleagues. You can go show your friends. Was that fun? Okay, let's take it up a level in chapter 2.
What do you need to do a Figuration Prelude? What's the prerequisites?
Well, the Figuration Prelude is, it's all of this kind of stuff. It's any piece that can be easily understood as a harmonic progression in a specific number of voices that's broken up into a recognizable pattern. And so because it's made of those very simple elements, now you don't need to think about a whole lot of other stuff that sometimes happens in music. You only have to get that pattern down and then think through how the voices are moving. So it's a wonderful entry into multi-voiced playing and improvising, because it limits all these other problems that show up later, like imitation and, real counterpoint, differentiation of rhythms between the voices, that kind of stuff. You don't have any of that. So it's wonderfully accessible.
You need a few harmonies to start a Figuration Prelude, and so what kind of chords do you need?
Well, you can do anything you want. I chose to start with what I call the page 1 progression, and there is a ferocious international war currently going on to determine what we will call this. One of my enemies refers to it as the Luli. He's not really my enemy. He's my friend. But anyway, and it's this. And by the way, if you know the podcast Reply All, which has nothing to do with music, their theme song is that, which I have no idea why. But anyway, those are the first 4 chords, first 4 measures of the well-tempered clavier. So I call it the page 1. So that's a good opener. I use that, and actually it takes quite a while to understand that in 5, 4, and 3 voices and in all the positions of the soprano. That's a day of work right there. And then we extend the piece by using sequential patterns. So that's a nice descending 7/6 sequential pattern, and it also modulated to the dominant. And now I can play page 1 in the dominant and then do a rising 5/6 sequence back to the home key, and there's a whole piece. Now I would need to apply figuration to that, depending whether it's 3 or 4 voices. Typically, I would have the option of some different figurations, and that really, you can make an entire 2-minute prelude out of that.
how do you break up the chord, so to speak, to create a figuration? And how many types of figurations can you come up with?
Well, theoretically, they're infinite, although when we do three voices, suddenly the number of possible patterns is greatly reduced. And so the most common one in the Baroque is where you play the bass first, and then you do the other two voices like that. And we hear that in... and I call this the umpadita because it sounds like you're saying umpadita. So... And so fantastic. Now I'm applying that.
Oh, it's fantastic. And you're saying, and you've taught this in master classes and workshops, you can get kids and students and faculty to immediately start making music.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why I start with this, even though no one historically would say, let's do page one and then figuration. They, as you know, you're well aware of this, they do consonants, dissonance, intervals, and then rule of the octave. And I do teach rule of the octave, and it is kind of the first big task that they have. But it takes, to get from the point of just learning it to being ready to do it in Parlamento, it's at least a couple of weeks of very hard work.
Well, your chapter 2 is toccata. Now, why is toccata chapter 2?
Because toccatas are so irresponsible and free. You don't have to stay in one meter. You don't have to repeat. You don't have to remember any thematic material. You can start and stop. You can go in and out of time. You can be stream of consciousness. I mean, it's really just a grab bag of flashy musical ideas. And so that's great for improvisation when, again, you're trying not to let the player get shut down by too many obligations and variables. You're trying to create the sense of freedom and permission just to go ahead and play. And so I use the Bach D minor toccata, BWV 565, which probably isn't even by Bach, so what? Because it is so sectional. It just does a cool thing and then does a different cool thing and then does that an octave higher and then forgets about it and then does something else and then stops. And so then we talk about how to put different ideas into all these little slots, really. It's almost like filling in a Mad Lib. In the first line, do something flashy that has a tonic and dominant relationship. In the second one, do something descending. In the third one, do something with diminished chords. And you can generate wonderful music like this. And again, the goal is that it is not intimidating or forbidding. It's freeing.
Do you need a couple of chords to have fun with toccata? What's the amount of harmonic knowledge you need?
Well, it's a great exercise to see how far you can just get with 1 and 5. I've always felt like the last set of variations of Beethoven from Opus 111 is he's coming back to the whole question of 1 and 5 and asking again. It's like asking, after all this, is there really a God? Does life have meaning? And it is like he's coming back and going, does 5 really go to 1? To 1 and 5? He's after, anyway. So just playing around with 1 and 5, you can actually create a lot of music.
Do you show how to do cadences in the book?
Yeah, I do. At one point, I talk about them as 2-5-1 cadences to try to connect with the way a lot of modern people would think. And then later I come back and teach the actual Parlamento categories, which are different. They're, the simple compound and double cadences.
You mentioned rule of the octave. That's chapter 3. And it really is so interesting because not only was it in Italy, you write in the book that C.P.E. Bach had a whole extensive use of that in teaching in his treatise as well. Could you talk about the rule of the octave and just how important it is?
Well, some of my colleagues will say, well, C.P.E. Bach didn't call it that, and he was thinking about it a little differently. Yes, true. But the basic idea is that the bass scale, a scale in the bass, every note of that scale has a specific harmony that you can memorize. And then you generate your music by just moving the bass around, and each one automatically has a good sounding harmony that will sound legit and classical and real, and will avoid parallels and will generate the kind of harmonic stuff that is appropriate to that time in history. So yes, it kept being taught. It was brought to Paris. The thorough bass tradition in Germany had something similar. I love it because I see rule of the octave as a default background harmonic language. There are more sophisticated things one can do harmonically, some really cool voice leading things that one can learn. But when one isn't doing one of these special moves, you sort of default to rule of the octave. Rule of the octave is the small talk of Baroque music. When we don't have something really exciting going on, we just chat like, well, how's the weather in Singapore? And it's a little bit bland. It's a little bit uneventful, but it's completely correct. Now, I will say this. One of the challenges we do on my online school is we try to play some of these partimenti that are only in rule of the octave and see if we can actually make them stunningly beautiful. And you can. And that is, to me, is a miracle. The default boring student language of this period actually can be made shockingly beautiful.
I'm sure people would ask you, Professor Mortensen, do you have a standard version of the rule of the octave that you want me to learn? What's the study plan you have for me? Do you want me to learn it, the Fenaroli, the Durante, the CPE Bach? Which one do you want me to do?
Yeah, and there are variants in them. One of the variants, of course, is when we descend in minor, whether we do that or that. And the way I explain it is if you do this one, you're going to sound a little bit more galant and Italian and Mozartish and operatic. Where is my hairbrush? It's that kind of operatic thing. Whereas this is going to sound more like a lamento from the earlier Baroque, maybe a little more German. So assuming the students have the bandwidth to deal with this and they're not already overwhelmed, yeah, absolutely, we'll show them that. When they don't, I will just probably stick with one. I often use Furno because Furno's treatise is the most orderly and it's easiest to see what he's talking about at every step. Whereas Durante and Fenaroli, when you go from their treatise to their partimenti, often you don't know, was there some lesson in between that I missed? Why? Whereas Furno, you know exactly what you're supposed to do on each of those partimenti. So I love Furno.
Now, you had, I was amazed at the variations that CPE Bach had on the rule of the octave, and it hit that page you put up in the book.
Yeah.
It's almost overwhelming. And how do you chew through that?
Well, and again, someone might say, well, that's not really rule of the octave anymore because he's varied it so much that now it's another thing. That's fine. Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. The point is he's still just showing you a scale in the bass and some harmonic possibilities that arise from the scale in the bass that are very, very rich. And I take that as the foundation of keyboard improvisation, that it's understanding the motion of the bass and all of the possibilities that arise from that, both through rule of the octave and moves of the partimento and everything else. It's the bass absolutely generates the whole thing. And that's the foundation of everything that I teach, is it all starts in the bass.
It's so great because the next chapter is Diminution, and it's such an important one because it transforms the player's thinking horizontally instead of vertically. And you teach how to extend the melodies, or rather fill them in. So instead of just quarter notes, you learn how to write flowing 16th notes. And you mentioned sources like Spiridion, Monte Carmelo, and how do you teach diminution in the book?
Well, like everything in improvisation, if it's going to work in real time, in front of people, it has to be extremely solid. And so it has to be learned incrementally and reinforced. This is not, we're not writing an article that we can proofread and correct and then submit. We're doing something where we perform in real time. And so I start with very incremental diminution. So we might take a rule of the octave scale, or we might take a simple partimento and first play it just in quarter notes. So let me just play a few chords in rule of the octave. So just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up the scale. And then I would say, all right, let's develop some rules for diminution. If I'm going to rise a step, I first can leap a third past it. So now, okay, so now the bass has that. Now I can do a different one. Okay, so that's all going to be by step. Now, in the other voices, let's add something to the soprano. And by the way, the simplest diminution is this. Is just repeating the same note. That already. Well, now let's trade that between voices. It's not a masterpiece, but it sounds sort of like music.
Flowing. I love it. And how do you get to flowing 16th notes then from that?
Again, you can actually do it sort of scientifically, where you look at the interval that you have to fill in. And there are even rules for this. If you're going a third, you can do those kind of patterns. And there are even charts where you can do these. And if you want to memorize them, hey, I have to span a fourth, therefore here's my diminution. I do think that the best way is just to spend time at the keyboard, improvising, goofing around, riffing, and just getting stuff in your mind and your hands that works. So that I think stays longer. I don't think any of us kind of mentally consult a chart while we're performing. We use what the body has learned in that real time.
How do you avoid contrapuntal clams? Because sometimes you might be trying to come up with ideas, but you don't know if you're just not jiving contrapuntally correctly, and you might come up with things that you're not aware of, certain parallels and that kind of things. Is there a way to kind of help yourself prevent bad counterpoint?
Yeah, I will say that I occasionally catch myself in a real clunker in a concert. I'm surprised how rarely it happens, given that I'm not that smart. The reason it doesn't happen a lot more is because rule of the octave and bass motions inherently avoid parallels. So if all the stuff I have learned to say harmonically is built on these ideas, that doesn't include parallels. There's the old joke, why do you play the piano so accurately? Well, I don't practice wrong notes. Why do you play without voice leading errors? Well, because the harmonic language I practice doesn't include them. And so the habits that one gets from these practices just naturally avoid them. Now, once in a while, you make a misjudgment and your hand goes the wrong way. That's just going to happen in live performance, in live improvisation. But overall, no. I mean, you really don't. It really is not the main problem. It really isn't like what keeps me awake at night.
There's so many great examples you can use from your book. Do you recommend your students look at the corpus of available literature and steal?
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. I have pages and pages in my personal notebooks of just passages where it's just some cool idea. Like, well, here's a really great sounding sequence, or here's a really interesting way of harmonizing this or that. And I just copy them. And I always do it by hand with a pen, because then I remember everything. I don't take a photo of it and keep it in a file. I don't, photocopy it or anything. I always write by hand. And I have 2 fat notebooks full of stuff like that.
The next chapter is variations, which were very common in the 18th century. They're a wonderful way of creating more music on top of existing music. What's the way that you teach variations?
Again, the cool thing about variations is that it gives you a template that now takes away the fear of, or some of the fear of, how am I going to come up with any kind of music? And the template, of course, is simply the harmonic progression. And so one of the progressions that I like is the hand-all. HWV 435, the Chaconne in G, which interestingly is just rule of the octave going down. It's also the opening of the Goldberg variations. So it goes down from 1 all the way down to 3, and then 3, 4, 5 to 1. 8 bars, I think. And that's it. And it's in 3/4. So that's all you have to know. Then what I teach in the book is develop a library of variation ideas by stealing things from Handel and everyone else. So we go through Handel and Witt and some other stuff, and we just go, oh, what did he do for this variation? Well, he played a chord on the downbeat, and then he played a bunch of repeated notes. Now that would be irritating to do a whole variation like that. But the idea is you very quickly can see, first of all, every variation includes the harmonic progression. Every variation is really about one thing. So that little rhythm, that jumps between those two notes, and the harmony on the downbeat. Now I know everything I need to know to create the whole variation. It's done. How about scales? Something like that. And then in the left hand. And often one variation will give you the idea for the next variation, because one of the things in particular that Handel loves to do is have the right hand and left hand talk to each other. Right hand has an idea, left hand says, oh yeah, I'll see your idea and I'll raise you one. And then they go, let's be friends. And they do the idea together, sort of like in parallel motion or something. So variation plays itself. Once you get the idea, the doors really open, and it's really quite easy to invent variations because they're so simple, and they don't have to be about anything profound, and they're a great deal of fun. And they sound like they all go together. They sound like they're all from the same piece of music. So again, it fights against this idea that improvisation is terrifying and humiliating, and I'm gonna look stupid, and I'm not gonna have any idea what I'm doing unless I have 3 PhDs. And that's why I love to teach it.
Lyricism gets its own chapter, and it involves trying to improvise something that has like a ballad, a slow tempo, where the soprano, the melody has a very prominent role. We've been talking about figurations, variations, diminutions, but at some point, someone needs to develop this art of melody, like having a nice melody. How do you build that lyrical quality, that melodic idea? Is it shaped by the chords? Is it shaped by the counterpoint with the bass? How do you develop that lyrical skill at melody?
Yeah, well, again, some of it is book learning, and most of it is stuff you get in your ear, in your mind, in your hand from just doing it. In the case of lyricism, again, you can lay down certain things and say, this is just going to be included. Now you don't have to worry about it. In this lyrical style, the left hand will tend to play something repeated, like in the Italian concerto. It's going to be these little chords and this little heartbeat thing in the left hand for the whole piece. And then the right hand is where all the Eddie Van Halen stuff is going to happen. And then I think there's, like the Marcello. How's it go? It might be in 3/4, I forget. That kind of music where the left hand's very, very simple. Great, now I don't have to think about that. Now I can only focus on what makes this lyrical part interesting and beautiful. And what we find out is, well, of course it fits the harmony, but it's going to use non-harmonic tones in intelligent, strategic ways, suspensions and retardations and appoggiaturas and neighbor tones and cambiatas and all of that stuff. it's going to have a shape. It's going to reach for the skies, and then it's going to swoop down, and then it's going to labor its way up the hill, and then it's going to fall. So it's going to have this real gravitational roller coaster quality to it. And then I'm going to learn some really practical things like, well, what if I'm going through a scale? 1, 2, 3 fits like that, and then 5, 7, 1 fits there, 3, 4, 5. Oh, cool. So now I can kind of just riff on this chord if I know about that. And one develops this kind of library of riffs that are stylistically appropriate. One that you see all the time, like the cheapest one in Baroque music, is right hand descending scale. Let's say we're in whatever D major, and you do a scale from 1 to 1, and then 5 to 5. So it's 1 to 1, 5 to 5, 1 to 1, 5 to 5, and that sounds a little bit more broken up and interesting than just a scale, and yet, for most keys, it's pretty easy to get the fingering of that without practicing. And this shows up over and over and over and over in Baroque music. And in earlier keyboard music, they break it between the hands. 4 notes in one hand, 4 notes in the other hand. Right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand, right hand. So you could play very fast without practicing.
I have actually a mini question related to this. Somebody would ask you, I love all the materials. How do I finger this?
Yeah, I don't get into technique just because the book would be 10 times as long. There's nothing in here that is spectacularly virtuosic. There's no, Chopin etude level, Winter Wind kind of stuff. There's no Petrushka. Everything is reasonably playable by someone with a moderate piano background, or if some example I give isn't, there's something else they could do that would work that's easier. But no, to start to get into, whenever you're in this situation and you're modulating here, you should always use your third finger on F sharp, unless it's cloudy outside. And, how can you write a book like that? How could anybody read a book like that? It'd be unbearable.
Now, the chapter on suite, you introduce it by talking about someone called Friedrich Erhard Nietzsche, who wrote his, I'm going to butcher this, but the Musikalische Handleitung. Now, talk about the chapter of the suite and Nietzsche himself, why you featured him in this chapter.
Yeah, Nietzsche is not unknown, and lots of people performing like pianists don't know about him and stuff, but theorists and musicologists absolutely do. And I'm by no means the first to direct attention to him. The reason I love the Musikalische Handleitung is because it's so practical. It's just so practical. What he does is he says, okay, here's a bass. And I think he even calls it a rotten bass, a schlecht. He says it's schlecht, which is one of my favorite German word, schlecht. And he says this stupid bass, but if you understand the harmony really nicely, you learn that, and then you just tattoo on top of it, you superimpose the qualities of the different dance suites. So Allemande, what's an Allemande? Well, it's in 4/4, and it has this kind of stuff. It has those kind of rhythms with a little pickup, moderate tempo. There's a B section that starts in the dominant, makes its way back home. You got yourself an Allemande. And then he says, now courant is in this meter, so change these things, then do a sarabande, and then you can do a gigue. So when I first came across Nietzsche, I thought, well, this is ingenious, because one bass line, and it's schlecht. If you know that, you could improvise the entire suite and no one would know that you're reusing the same bass line and the same harmonies. So I decided I would try this out. So the first thing I did, I spent 2 days memorizing this progression in all 24 keys. So I had to do a few alterations to make it work in minor, but just so I could do it instantly in any key. And then I would practice the different rhythms. And so then you have this wonderful thing you can do where you go to a concert and you say, will anyone pick any of the 24 major and minor keys, and I will instantly play a Baroque dance suite for you. And so some smart aleck will go E flat minor, which is what always happens. Well, it doesn't matter because I already know this in E flat minor, and so it's very familiar. So I can just play a Baroque suite in E flat minor. And I thought this will be very, very good for, I think audiences will love this. And I think this will show the power of these principles of historic improvisation. So I'm gonna do this. I've done it many times. And you know what? No one has ever said, hey, you recycled that harmonic progression. No, nobody's ever caught me. Now they will because I admitted it to you. But
well, now we get into a chapter, Imitation, where the first chapters were you could really get a handle of it because it made conceptual sense. But now we're dealing with time shifting. Now, there's something where a lot of people say, okay, this is now where it doesn't matter if it's Baba Black Sheep or some simple nursery rhyme. The moment you start imitating, people panic. They're like, uh-oh. Now, it doesn't matter how simple the melody is. You suddenly have to keep multiple things in your mind. How do you bridge the gap to learning imitation and make it not so scary?
Yeah, this is where we jump from kind of Teletubbies to Doctor Who. You have to deal with time travel. The actual points of imitation I talk about are quite simple, and I start extremely simple by, one voice will play, and then it will just hold a note while the other voice imitates. So it's to try to reduce that multiple timeline phenomenon as much as possible. And ease into it. But then, gradually we do get more complicated. I spent an entire summer working on Fugue Expositions because my sense of this was I know how fugues work. I've written fugues. I've played a lot of the Walter Clavier and other stuff and Shostakovich and Bach, Busoni transcriptions and all of that. I know how they work. I even wrote one for a symphonic band and two pianos. So, I know how they work, but actually to do it in real time when it's not scripted, this is a completely, almost unrelated thing. It's an unrelated experience. And I thought there's something very intuitive and somatic about this experience. And I think I need time to let it sink in. And so I'm just going to do this for 2 hours every day and see what I learn after a summer. And I could get these headaches and frustrated and stuff, but I really do think it develops new neural pathways that start to make this stuff possible. And it's not that hard to see how the Neapolitans and others, since they inculcated this stuff from childhood, of course, these people were fluent at it. If you've never done it before and you're 42 years old and you decide you want to improvise a double fugue, of course, you're going to hit the wall without preparing. But so to go back to the points of imitation, there's more just sitting down and trying things and making mistakes and being patient and having a cup of tea by your side and being zen about the whole thing before you get the reward.
Can you talk about your training in counterpoint? Because you've mentioned you wrote fugues, and did that relate to your understanding of all of this? Because counterpoint, you seem to think very horizontally and you seem to think in terms of lines. Can you talk about your experience and counterpoint as a topic?
My counterpoint education is really terrible, and that's my own fault. I did have courses in it, and I even managed to convince the professor at University of Michigan to let me into a grad course. It was an entirely written phenomenon, though. Counterpoint was taught as a thing you did on paper, and I was not great at it. I found some of my old homework assignments recently, and they were covered with red pen and words like, oh, wow, and God have mercy, stuff like that.
Wow. And that's a tough professor.
Yeah, he was. But he was from this world where, he could play actually very well. But his idea of what you did was you wrote articles that were read by other scholars. And so that was the end goal of this, was to know and to, put something on paper. It wasn't to go to the practice room and get this or that pattern in your mind. So there was no actual assignment to play anything. It was just a turn in papers. So, I
Do you think
tried.
counterpoint is not being taught correctly?
I don't want to,
Or maybe would you say there's another approach to counterpoint that's not being
Yeah,
done?
I mean, to me, I value the articles, the academic articles and stuff. I read them and learn from them. But to me, what's really important, and the reason I'm doing any of this is because I think music is for people. And I did all of this to go to the stage and to play for people and to show other people how to make music, not to make articles and books and treatises. And so I'm interested in what works for normal, reasonably intelligent, reasonably disciplined people, but not the geniuses of the world who want to learn to make music. So if I can't do it on that basis, I'm kind of not that interested, and I might not finish the article. But if you can show me, if you spend 3 hours working on this skill, you will actually walk away with something, great. Now I'm really interested. Now I want to know how that works.
That's a great segue because it relates to two of your remaining chapters, which are immensely practical chapters, Parlamento and Schemata. Well, let's talk about Parlamento first. Is it to help people get into it?
Yeah, it's just to lay out what a Parlamento is and the basics of how to do the easiest ones. Now, the more difficult Parlamento fugues with multiple entrances, I don't address that. That's a whole book on its own. But the simple ones, like I think I do Fenaroli and Sanguine. I don't know if I did Furno in there. What is going on and what you're supposed to know and how you do it. So I kind of come up with a 3-step process of recognize, realize, and stylize, where you take that Parlamento and you go through the process of turning it into a piece of music. But in doing so, you're learning harmony and voice leading and improvisation and composition and keyboard style all at the same time, which is the real power of Parlamento. As many like Giorgio Sanguinetti and Peter Ventura have pointed out, this is why it's so great, is because you're doing everything musically in one activity. It's ear training and your hands are moving and you're thinking about rhythm and you're doing voice leading and you're modulating and you're being musical and dramatic. I mean, everything is there. It's so great. So that's what that chapter is just how that whole world works.
I'd love to get your insight on you teaching this to your students, because we always know about child prodigies, the Neapolitans historically. These children could do amazing things. But do you find that even with undergraduates, this is not just for prodigies? This is something that anyone can use and anyone can really benefit from. This is something that can be applied to anybody.
Yes. And in the last year or so, I've taught a lot more age groups. Most of my work is college age, undergrad and grad. And with them, because they're already immersed in music and they understand a lot, within about 1 hour, you can explain to a conservatory student this whole world. You can explain how the basics work and what they would have to do to move forward. And the answer is always the same. They always say 2 things. 1, where has this been all my life? And why didn't anybody tell me? It's always the same. I've heard this in many countries. But in the last year, I was at Chetham's in Manchester, UK, which is sort of the Hogwarts of music. It's a residential school for younger people. Actually, part of Harry Potter was filmed there.
No kidding. So, it truly is Hogwarts.
It's actually the Hogwarts of music. I mean, they have a cafeteria and Anyway, it was really fun because even some of the younger kids, you could explain voice leading ideas, bass motions. For example, the Corelli leapfrog. With all those glorious climbing suspensions, they can sing it. I mean, they can sing it beautifully after 5 minutes of instruction. They take to this stuff like a duck to water. So to me, that's very promising and delightful. And then online with Improv Planet, we have about 300 students there. And we just had an improv challenge where everyone could do their own, whatever they wanted to do with Furno's first Parlamento, and post a video. And it was pure delight to see what all these people, different ages, different levels of experience, amateurs, professionals, all over from continents all over the world. This wonderful stuff they came up with. I was absolutely thrilled. And I thought, people making music and being creative and doing something kind of difficult but interesting and then sharing it with each other, that is good for the world. This is very, very good for the world if this happens. So that gives me some hope.
Your YouTube channel is excellent, Cedarville Music, where you post your latest piano pandemic activities. And yes, you mentioned Improv Planet. And what really hardens me is that pretty much almost every single comment is, thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for showing us a different way. Thank you. And of course, there's always one maniac who doesn't like what you're doing. But generally speaking, 99% of everyone is saying thank you for showing us that you can improvise in historic or classical music.
Yeah, there seems to be a strong interest. Yeah, there's some maniacs and mean people, but that's what the internet does. Is it allows us to easily dehumanize each other without consequences. So yeah, you're right. It is encouraging, and
now is this when your journey in learning improvisation? What was this like 10 years ago?
It wasn't happening 10 years ago. This is more recent than that for me. What happened is 10 years ago, I started to get really bored, and I love classical music and I love the standard piano repertoire. But I didn't love the idea that this was all I was going to do for the rest of my life. If this is all Grigori Sokolov is going to do for the rest of his life, that's great. But if it's all I'm going to do, I'm a little bit dismayed. So first of all, I wanted to play jazz. So I spent some time learning to be, I won't say great or anything, but let's say responsible in doing that. And I started to add jazz to my classical programs, not jazz arrangements, but actual improvisations. And from there, it started to strike me that this can't be very far from some of the things that are happening in classical music, especially variation, chaconne, variation, passacaglia, which is no different from playing over the changes, as every jazz musician knows. And so the first thing I did publicly, I was playing some variations of Handel. And without telling anybody, I would sneak in, I would improvise a variation of my own right in the middle, or one or two, and not say anything in case it went badly. I would not admit it. And then I would start telling the audience I was going to do that and telling them they had to guess which one, and then from there I said, well, it's not that far from here. From here you could throw a rock and hit improvising the entire thing. So that started, and then from there I started to go, all right, what else? What about prelude and fugue and suite and overture, and what would it take? So I had some help. I did go to Eastman for a summer thing, and I met with a wonderful guy that John Andrew Slaminski, and Eduardo Bellotti, the Italian organist, and they were very helpful. I saw what their approach was. And then after that, I sort of went home and just thought about it and said, all right, what would it take? And went into my mad scientist lab for a while.
We missed a chapter. We missed the last chapter, which is schemata. And schemata is a new concept. It's not I mean, I don't know if there is, but maybe a scholar can correct me, but maybe there's not that many sources that people use schemata historically, but it's gained incredible popularity recently and for just coming up with instant Lego blocks of music. And so how do you treat schemata in your book?
Yeah, you're right. Schemata is not anything that they would have taught or done. It's a modern way of trying to understand their thought processes. And but it works. And to me, it primarily works in something that sounds a little bit more like Mozart or Haydn. It doesn't work as well for improvising the counterpoint and the denser textures and fugue. To me, Parlamento is the way. But it's wonderful. So, for example, you can say, all right, let's take a template of a minuet. Here's X number of bars. And in the first 2 bars, you can do this or this. In the second 2 bars, you can do this or this. And so it's really not that difficult then to sort of let students fill those in, with a do, re, mi, or a Romanesca, or a printer, or any of that kind of stuff. And these are all... The thing about schemata is they're essentially 2 voices. They're outer voices. what are the outer voices doing, whereas Parlamento is what is all the voices doing. So that's the distinction I would draw. Personally, I use the ideas of schemata to improvise some. I use the ideas of Parlamento all the time.
This is an unrelated question, but I had to ask you this. I saw on your faculty page that you have an interest in traditional Irish music. Now, could you talk about that? Yeah. Is that something? Do you play? Do you jam? Do you have would people be surprised to see you jamming with people like in an Irish pub?
They might. I'm not practicing it right now because I'm too busy with other stuff, but we had a group for a while, and I learned mandolin, Irish flute, Irish accordion, and some other stuff. And yeah, I would actually go to pubs and play.
That is so cool.
Had a group. We had a group that we would do Irish and American roots music. I just adore roots music. In fact, I have to play a benefit concert this summer, and I have to get the mandolin out and jam with some of my yokel friends, some of my friends in low places.
Oh, I can't help but see the parallels between, like, for instance, Celtic fiddle improvisation and kind of the diminutions of classical improvisation.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Although the other connection that really appeals to me is, this idea that music is for people. There was a wonderful book by musicologist Christopher Small from the 90s where he invented this word musicking, which is the activity of making music together. And he explains, it's really this kind of social ritual. And that has helped me come to appreciate kinds of music that would not pass the test of being great classical music. For example, I'm not necessarily predisposed to love every form of pop music, but sometimes I see how it's functioning in a culture and how it's bringing people together. Hip hop, for example. I've really come to appreciate hip hop. My daughter and my son really got into Hamilton, and I just saw the power of this and the ingenuity and the beauty of it, and came to respect it a lot. And I thought, this is musicking. This is like a way of bringing people together. And I think improvisation has that power as well, because it is so dependent on teaching and working closely together and sharing what we've learned. So I sort of see some parallels between these styles of vernacular and popular music and historic improvisation, because it's for people and it brings people together.
You were interviewed on The Guardian recently, and it was a fantastic article. It's so great to see classical improvisation reach a mainstream audience, and we're seeing more and more of that. There was one anecdote that I have to ask you. It mentioned that you were not allowed to visit a university to lecture because a senior professor could not improvise. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Do you want me to out the place?
No. But yeah, tell me about that. What happened there?
Yeah, I think I was thinking of one school in particular where I knew one of the faculty, and this person was very interested in this, but said, "Oh, we could never do this because the top person can't and would never allow it to happen under the person's aegis because it would look bad." And then there was another school that. We were talking about going over there, and then one of the faculty said, "Oh, the piano faculty will never support an improvisation recital. It's not legitimate." Nice. So yeah, this kind of thing happens, and I've been very fortunate that I don't have to worry about it, because for every place that's not interested, plenty of others are. So I focus on those.
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, would you say that something's happening, something's in the air right now with this field?
It really seems like it. The fervency is on the part of the students. The faculty, the professors and so on, some are very open, some are very guarded, some would be happy to learn more. It varies, but the students, almost to a person, are incredibly eager, and I see that in many countries and in my own country as well. So that's what gives me hope.
I noticed that your book was published by the prestigious Oxford University Press, a great publisher. They seem to be producing some excellent books. How did you get to know the publisher? Did they reach out to you? What happened, and how did the seeds for the book come to be?
As far as the publishing goes, Oxford is a peer-reviewed academic press, and so they have a very formal procedure for submitting books to them. You have to send them, you can either send the complete thing or you can send a sample chapter, and you have to sort of write this whole legal argument about why it's not a terrible idea. And then they send it out to anonymous reviewers who are in the field, usually other professors, and they come back and they either say, yes, go with it with no changes. Almost all the time they say, you have to change this and that, and rewrite all this stuff. So it's a very long, painful, horrible process. But the good part is someone else's eyes have been on it, and one's own ego will be toned down a little bit, and crazy claims, unsubstantiated, one might make, get challenged, and it ends up being a better as a result. So I do believe in peer review, and having an editor who's pretty ruthless, who shoots down one's stupider ideas. And so that's why I wanted to work with them.
While I have you here, I want to just get your take on this. You're a pianist, but I wonder, what do you think of this whole solfeggio thing that's happening as well, which is coming out of the Parlamento tradition as well by Professor Nicholas Baragwanath? Is that interest you in any way, the hexachordal solfeggio?
Yes, it's very interesting because it was apparently a years-long part of the pedagogy. I mean, they were serious about this, and these were, as you know, the Neapolitans were practical. They were cranking out professionals. So there's something very, very powerful about it. I have not sat down to learn to do it because I'm busy with my own stuff. I would be curious how adaptable it is to our current educational system. I do believe that our current educational system, in theory, is not effective. It's not 100% defective, and I have seen some good results from theory. But on the whole, the undergrads that I know who finished the 2-year sequence, for the number of credits and hours that are put into that, it doesn't really show. They're not really all that fluent. Here's what I think happened in 20th century theory. I think 20th century theory was partly developed because the ideals of the 20th century conservatory, at least in my country, in America, is that we are trying to churn out efficient performers for the modern composer, for the avant-garde composer who's going to write these atonal, polyrhythmic, difficult works. And so we want them to sing all these really hard intervals in isolation and be very efficient at it. And we want them to clap all these bizarre rhythms out of this little book, And so when we put them in an orchestra and we give them our avant-garde works, they will be able to execute all of it. To me, this is a profoundly self-centered thing that was done. Because these theory guys were probably composers, and they just wanted their own build me an army worthy of Mordor. That's 20th century theory, and they weren't really thinking so much about, well, what will this student actually have for herself, for her own musicianship. So it sometimes strikes me, especially the Ottman book, when I read the Ottman book, or the fact that Theory 4, the 4th semester, is entirely atonal stuff. And pitch sets and 12 tone. Nobody is going to use that. No undergrad is going to use that. And what you're doing is cheating them out of the ability to improvise Happy Birthday in any key, which is what they actually need to be able to do. So anyway, I just went on a rant. That was fun.
No, absolutely.
Thank you for introducing me.
I want to end off by saying, Professor Mortensen, you are like a superhero, and you're so eloquent, and you're basically you're like a figurehead for the movement because you're visible. You're saying all the right things. You have a fantastic book out. I really hope it becomes a book that every kid buys and puts on their piano mantelpiece so that they can refer to it. You're doing a stellar work. My good friend Christopher Jengalevsky, who co-hosts the Friday Morning Music Podcast with me, he's a drummer and he loves your videos. And he doesn't even play, he plays piano, but he's a drummer. He loves your videos. He's telling me he's using your videos, so it goes to show that you're reaching a wide audience. Please continue your good work. And where can people find you? What would you like to mention other than the book, which is The Pianist's Guide to Historic Improvisation, published by Oxford University Press? Where else can they find you, and how can they connect with you?
Anything they might want to know would be on my website, johnmortensen.com. And I keep a little gallery of live performance videos in case anyone wants to know what this stuff sounds like in concert. That's where I keep that kind of stuff. And from there, they can contact me, and there's a discussion forum, and there's Improv Planet. They can find all that other stuff just from my website.
Wonderful. Well, the great Professor John Mortensen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Always a pleasure, Nikhil. Take care.